Cultural goods are always designed for and delivered to, you could say, a given public. Culture is a public thing. It's a shared thing. If I just write something in my journal and I never publish it, never make it publish, it's not culture. It's writing, but it's not a cultural good that shapes some public. So obviously a sermon, assuming people show up Sunday morning, has a public. So a sermon is a cultural good for that group of people. And the first way in which a sermon is a cultural good is it shapes the culture of that particular congregation in a very significant way, both because of its form, but also the interpretation it offers of what the world is about, what we're about as God's people in the world. Now, in another sense, a sermon is rarely a cultural good because its public rarely extends beyond the people in church that day. And so to our neighbors who don't come to our church, it's very hard for the sermon to be a cultural good because it doesn't address them, it doesn't reach them. It's like an entry in the private Christian journal, and we all read this journal, but unless it's translated into public, into my town, into my neighborhood, into my city, in some way that it becomes accessible to a wider community, then it really never reaches the status of a cultural good for that wider community, no matter how important it is for the church. Now, should sermons be a cultural good in that wider sense? They were at one time, and I think many of us feel kind of nostalgia for the time when someone would preach a sermon and it would be of such import that it would be reported on the papers. I mean, this happened in the 19th century all the time. And it happened at key moments in the 20th century. What is in every important respects a sermon is preached on at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and becomes one of the most dramatic moments of oration in American history because it was done in public, because it didn't just happen in a church, but Martin Luther King Jr. preached it in front of America, really. But that's by far the exception. So the question is, can our more ordinary sermons, our prosaic sermons, be a real contribution to the culture around us? Well, only to the extent that they are somehow published, made public. That doesn't have to mean you send them to the newspaper and the newspaper publishes them, because who is most likely to make your sermon public? It's the people in your church. And are you equipping them to take what you teach them into their places of work, the schools where they teach and study, the playgrounds where they play and oversee play? Are you giving them something that they could take into public? Am I offering my congregation something they could take to their neighbor, and without their neighbor necessarily having to accept every aspect of the gospel, that this could be in some way good news, or at least intriguing news for their neighbor, that it could be communicated? And this in turn means that I think culturally serious preaching has to begin with the question, not just what does my congregation need to hear, but what do their neighbors, what would I want my neighbors to hear from my congregation that I could share with my congregation, that they could in turn publish for a wider community. It would be one of my deepest hopes that we would learn to preach in a way that encourages and equips Christians to be creators and cultivators of culture. Mostly, I do not think that is happening right now. And the fundamental reason I think it is not happening is I don't think we really are passionate about our people's call to be present in culture. And this is partly because often as ministers of the gospel, we are not fully present in culture. So much preaching, when it addresses culture, addresses it in the register of critique. That is to say, we mine the surrounding culture for examples of how to do it wrong or badly or sinfully in order to provide a kind of foil or contrast for our picture of what the true good life is. And I'm struck by how rarely I hear preachers using culture as anything other than a sort of admonitory example, like this is how not to do it. So when we preach about business, we talk about greed. When we preach about politics, we talk about corruption. When we preach about media, we talk about pornography or exploitation. We never talk about, or rarely do I hear preachers talk about, business as the creation of opportunity and wealth, politics as the right ordering of justice, media as the bringing to life of stories that are true and good and beautiful, even if painful. Why don't we tell those stories? Why don't we talk about culture in that way? Because that would give our members of our churches a way to imagine themselves as Christian actors in those places. When all we tell are the negative stories, and God knows that there is much to critique in culture, but when all we tell is those stories, then the implication is that a true follower of Christ will be somehow separate from that. And guess where they'll be? They'll be serving as volunteers in the Sunday school room. There's nothing wrong with volunteering for Sunday school. But a friend of mine was talking with his pastor years ago at a church in Boston. And his pastor said, you know, we have a woman in our congregation who litigated, on behalf of the Environmental Protection Agency, litigated the cleanup of Boston Harbor, one of the major environmental cases of the 20th century. And the pastor said, it occurred to me the other day that every year we celebrate that she teaches second grade Sunday school. And we have never celebrated that she was the lead litigant on the cleanup of this part of God's creation called Boston Harbor. Now, by all means, celebrate the volunteers in your churches and the lawyers in your churches who also teach Sunday school. But also, is there something to celebrate in the legal work they are doing? Yes, it's God-honoring. It's an example of culture at its best. Why don't we match some of those examples of culture at its worst with examples of culture at its best? Because that's what orients Christian people, I think, to what they can hope to be in the world. If we don't offer a biblical vision of what people are doing in culture, they will absorb the cultural vision of what you do in culture. So if you live in a culture dominated by ambition, people will orient themselves culturally around ambition. If you live in a culture dominated by reputation and pleasing people, that's how people orient themselves. And their culture making will reflect the values that their culture offers them. The great privilege we have as Christian preachers is to offer another better story to explain what people are doing 6 days a week. That when you are coaching a soccer team or building a small business or writing a novel or working as a journalist or farming or whatever your people do, you are not just part of the story their culture tells them they're a part of. You are part of a bigger, better story. And that story begins in a garden and ends in a city. It begins with God cultivating the world and ends with all the fruits of human image bearing being brought into this glorious new heavens and new earth in which God is fully worshipped and honored through the worship of people in a city, in a culturally complex environment. That is a story they are never going to hear in the school where they teach or the business where they work or on the farm that they work on. But they can hear that in your church. And it can give dignity and motivation and significance to every aspect of human work. If we don't preach that, they'll never hear it. If we do preach it, I believe they will become better culture makers, and it will give them much more deep reasons to come to church on Sunday in order to connect their life of faith with their life in the world, rather than just having a compartmentalized, spiritualized life that is very disconnected with what they're doing for the rest of their week.